Welcome, everyone. My name is Micah Schwartzman, and I am director of the Karsh Center for Law and Democracy at the University of Virginia School of Law. On behalf of the university's president, Jim Ryan, I'm delighted to welcome you to the third installment of the Democracy Dialogues, which is co-sponsored by the University of Virginia's President's Office, the Institute of Democracy, the Miller Center, and the Karsh Center for Law and Democracy. The goal of Democracy Dialogues is twofold. The first is to explore critical issues facing our democracy through a variety of different perspectives. And the second is to model what it means to engage in civil discourse and debate with those whose perspectives or opinions might differ. And our belief is that these two goals are interrelated and that both are crucial when confronting issues of national importance. The Democracy Dialogues are made possible by the generous support of Ingrid and David Hang and UVA Rector Jim Murray. We extend thanks to George and Judy Marcus, whose Democracy Praxis Fund at the Miller Center helped to support today's program. I also want to recognize the generous and indeed transformative gifts made by Bruce and Martha Karsh to promote the study of democracy at the University of Virginia. Our conversations today will explore the Biden administration's recently released National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. As the president observed in his preface to the national strategy, domestic terrorism has reached into many American communities, including our own in Charlottesville, Virginia. For our discussion, I'm honored to be joined today by Elizabeth Sherwood-Randall. Dr. Sherwood-Randall is the assistant to the president for Homeland Security and deputy national security advisor. She leads work on a range of national security threats, including domestic violent extremism, natural disasters, and biothreats. From 2014 to 2017, Dr. Sherwood-Randall served in the Obama administration as Deputy Secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy. She was previously White House Coordinator for Defense Policy, Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction and Arms Control. And prior to that, she was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council. During the Clinton administration from 1994 to 1996, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Prior to returning to the White House, Dr. Sherwood-Randall served as the Resident Senior Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and was a distinguished professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. I'm also pleased to welcome our moderator, Fran Townsend. Ms. Townsend is Executive Vice President of Corporate Affairs, Chief Compliance Officer, and Corporate Secretary at Activision Blizzard. Prior to that, she was Vice Chairman, General Counsel, and Chief Administrative Officer at McAndrews and Forbes. From 2004 to 2008, Ms. Townsend was President George W. Bush's Homeland Security Advisor and chaired the Homeland Security Council. She also served as Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism from May 2003 to May 2004. Ms. Townsend spent 13 years at the U.S. Department of Justice under the administrations of President George H.W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, and President George W. Bush. She previously served on the Director of National Intelligence's Senior Advisory Group, the CIA External Advisory Board, and the U.S. President's Intelligence Advisory Board. Ms. Townsend was a contributor at CNN for 7 years and is now an on-air senior national security analyst for CBS News. With that, I will turn it over to Fran, who will lead us from here, and with many thanks to all of you in our audience for joining us.
Micah, thank you for those introductions. Before we start, I would invite the audience to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Liz, I can't thank you enough for doing this, and in particular that you chose to do it here at the University of Virginia. As Micah alluded to, the tragedy at Charlottesville left a huge impact on this community, and so your kindness in doing this here means a lot to the community. So let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Micah, and thank you, Fran, and good afternoon to everyone who's participating in this event. I am delighted to have the opportunity to speak at the University of Virginia's Miller Center and Karsh Center for Law and Democracy, even if only virtually, and to discuss the Biden administration's new national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. I had hoped to be able to come to Charlottesville in person, and I'm very thankful to have this opportunity to engage with the community today online. I asked to speak in the historic setting of Charlottesville because the nation was riveted 4 years ago this summer on the chilling events that reflected disturbing trends in our culture that raised the specter of domestic terrorism. President Biden launched his campaign by pointing to the violence that we saw in Charlottesville in August 2017, including domestic terrorist violence. He called it a battle for the soul of America. In his inaugural address, President Biden specifically pointed to a rise in political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat. The use of violence to pursue political ends is a profound threat to our public safety and our national security. And it's even more than that. It is a threat to our national identity, our values, our norms, our rule of law, our democracy. We saw this vividly on January 6th when the Congress and the U.S. Capitol were attacked. Democracy isn't something we create once. Democracy is a process, not a static condition. It is, as President Biden said today, a way of being. We have to renew it and reinvest in it in each generation, affirming a simple but profound premise that we can and must resolve our differences peacefully through civic discourse and at the ballot box, rather than through physical intimidation and violence. At the same time, our efforts to counter domestic terrorism must take place within the context of upholding American civil rights and civil liberties, the very freedoms that make us the United States of America. President Biden is briefed regularly on the domestic terrorism threat and has discussed what we need to be doing to counter it in a series of meetings in our first 5 months in office that he held with his key cabinet members, including Attorney General Garland, Secretary of Homeland Security Mayorkas, FBI Director Wray, and Secretary of Defense Austin. And he's consistently guided us to undertake this vital work without undermining our values and freedoms or inadvertently exacerbating the very challenges that we are seeking to address. Notably, we are tackling these challenges 20 years after the events of September 11, 2001, which led to the building of a strategy and indeed an entire architecture for countering global terrorist threats, which is work that Fran Townsend pioneered earlier in her career. We've learned a lot over the last 2 decades. That experience has taught us the importance of remaining true to who we want to be at home and in the world, and about finding the balance between countering very real threats while protecting basic freedoms that are the foundation of our democracy and our enduring advantage in the world. I'd like to explain some of the core guiding principles that informed our approach to that vital task, and then set forth the 4 key pillars of our strategy, which the Attorney General announced in a major speech at the Justice Department last week on June 15th. Our first guiding principle: start with the facts and analyze them rigorously. This is foundational to everything we do on this front, as it is more broadly in the national security domain. To establish an objective, fact-based view of the domestic terrorism challenge that we faced as a new administration in January 2021, President Biden tasked the intelligence and law enforcement communities during his first week in office to produce a comprehensive assessment of today's domestic terrorist threat. The goal was to understand the risks that domestic terrorists pose and let the expert assessment guide us as we formulate a strategy and implement it. The career professionals found that domestic violent extremists, motivated by a range of ideologies, pose an elevated threat to our country, with racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists and anti-government militia violent extremists posing the most lethal threat. Further, violent extremists who promote the superiority of the white race have the most persistent transnational connections. Overall, however, the report did not find a robust nexus between domestic terrorists and foreign actors. At this time, this is largely an inside-out problem not an outside-in problem, though we know that our adversaries are seeking to sow division in our country. This brings me to our second guiding principle. Make this a clear White House priority so that the entire U.S. government gives immediate attention to an urgent threat and sustains that attention throughout our administration. That is why we built a team at the National Security Council specifically dedicated to coordinating our government's domestic terrorism strategy, the first team of its kind ever created within the White House. We have learned lessons from international terrorism where we could, and we treat domestic terrorism as distinctive where we should. The third guiding principle underpinning this work is to ensure that we learn from the career professionals and experts who do this hard work every day. Our team has worked with an extraordinary community of relevant experts across the federal government, including law enforcement and Homeland Security components, and elements that haven't traditionally been part of national security conversations, including the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Veterans Affairs. They have helped us to grasp what important efforts are already underway to address issues related to domestic terrorism, and have shared lessons learned from previous efforts about where there are gaps and opportunities to innovate and improve, so that we evolve as quickly as the threat is evolving. The fourth guiding principle is that we must be in ongoing conversations with the broader stakeholder community, from civil rights groups to faith-based organizations, to technology companies, to universities like the one hosting this dialogue today, to law enforcement partners at the state and local level. We have also consulted with members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, to learn how they regard this evolving threat and to ensure they understand our approach. By following these core principles, we have developed America's first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, with a focus on 4 key pillars. The first pillar, which addresses understanding and sharing information about domestic terrorism, builds directly on that comprehensive threat assessment completed in March. We must understand this threat fully in order to address it fully. That's why we are ensuring that the federal government is gathering information on domestic terrorism comprehensively, within existing authorities and consistent with constitutional protections, to improve that understanding. For the first time, the Department of Justice is now tracking federal law enforcement investigations nationwide in this area comprehensively. For the first time, the Department of State and other agencies are making this issue a priority for information exchanges with foreign partners. And for the first time, we're creating a structured mechanism to ensure that our government benefits in a consistent and systematic way from the worthwhile research and analysis done on this issue by non-governmental experts like those at the Karsh and Miller Centers. That understanding informs the strategy's second pillar, which focuses on prevention. Drawing on the expertise of a variety of federal departments and agencies, we will work with communities to become more effective at preventing individuals from ever reaching the point of committing acts of terrorism. To do this, we will strengthen domestic terrorism prevention resources and services and work to improve public awareness of federal resources to address threatening behavior before violence occurs. For example, the Department of Homeland Security is building on its counterterrorism mantra that if you see something, you should say something. Recognizing that family, friends, and coworkers may be the first to realize that someone is radicalizing to violence, we need to create pathways for sharing information that feel comfortable and are easily accessible. For the first time, DHS has designated domestic violent extremism as a national priority area within the Department's Homeland Security Grant Program, which means that more than $77 million will be allocated to state, local, tribal, and territorial partners to prevent, protect against, and respond to domestic violent extremism. To offer another example, the Department of Defense is ensuring service members leaving the military are aware that they could be targeted for recruitment by violent extremists. We will also be augmenting efforts to address online terrorist recruitment and mobilization to violence by domestic terrorists. This is an enormous challenge and one that will require ongoing ingenuity and, importantly, collaboration with the private sector. This strategy directs increased information sharing with the technology companies, and the creation of innovative approaches to foster digital literacy and build resilience in the face of terrorist recruitment and mobilization online. Relatedly, in May, we announced our decision to join the Christchurch call to action to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. This is an international partnership among 56 governments and 10 technology companies, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, that works to develop new solutions to eliminating terrorist content online while safeguarding freedom of expression. This framework was forged by some of our closest foreign partners following the 2017 attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, that left 51 people dead and dozens wounded. What they've built has energized and guided an important global conversation about how to address terrorism threats online while protecting and indeed promoting freedom of expression that we as Americans cherish. And we're stronger when we stand together with countries that share our values, especially in urging technology companies to take the vital actions they need to take to secure their platforms against exploitation. Prevention efforts are important, but we know they will not always succeed in stopping radicalization toward violence. That's why the strategy's third pillar involves disrupting and deterring domestic terrorism. Federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement are critical to countering domestic terrorism. We are deliberately increasing our support to law enforcement to enable them to more effectively address domestic terrorism nationwide. As Attorney General Garland has emphasized, U.S. attorneys' offices and FBI field offices across the country are making domestic terrorism a top priority, with the Justice Department and the FBI reallocating or requesting appropriate funding and resources to target the threat. In the President's fiscal year 2022 budget, we have included over $100 million in additional resources for the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security to ensure that the federal government has the analysts, investigators, prosecutors, and other personnel and resources that it needs to thwart domestic terrorism and do justice when the law has been broken. State, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement will have access to increased intelligence sharing and training on domestic terrorism and associated threats. That includes, for example, enhanced training on domestic terrorism iconography, symbology, and phraseology, as well as augmented information on how to recognize potential indicators of mobilization to domestic terrorism. In the federal government, we are also working to address the potential insider threat that is posed by deliberate domestic terrorist recruitment of individuals who hold or who have held sensitive positions in the military and law enforcement. We are in particular improving employee screening to enhance methods for identifying domestic terrorists who might pose insider threats. The Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, and Justice are pursuing efforts to ensure domestic terrorists are not employed within our military or law enforcement ranks and to improve their screening and vetting processes. In addition, resources are being developed for state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement partners to enable them to enhance their own employee screening programs. And finally, we must also address long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. That is the fourth pillar of our strategy. This reflects the context within which our first three pillars are situated and involves broader possibilities for reducing the drivers of domestic terrorism over the years and generations to come. This includes by reducing persistent economic inequality and by helping those who feel left behind in a 21st century economy. Our long-term efforts also involve reducing and protecting Americans from racial, ethnic, and religious hatred, building trust in our institutions, working toward an information environment that fosters healthy democratic discourse, and stemming the flow of firearms to individuals intending to commit acts of domestic terrorism, including through initiatives that will be discussed by the President later today as part of the administration's gun violence and violent crime prevention strategy. While this work is beyond the remit of traditional counterterrorism work, our strategy will be situated within our administration's comprehensive efforts to strengthen the long-term health of our nation. I've learned across my opportunities to serve in government, with this being my fourth tour of duty, that strategies mean little unless they are translated into concrete and consequential action. Having first worked for Senator Biden when he was Senator Biden, when I was 26 years old, I can say with confidence that he puts a premium as president on effective implementation. The work of implementing this strategy so as to make Americans safer is already well underway. And in doing this work today and every day, we will remain vigilant against all threats to Americans, including those posed by terrorists internationally, because we will never take our eyes off threats to our safety and security, whether they come from home or overseas. It is a privilege to join each of you today to discuss this vital work. By tackling domestic terrorism together, each of us can make a contribution to safeguarding our precious democratic experiment. So I thank each of you, wherever you are today and whatever role you play, perhaps in the federal government, perhaps with a state, local, territorial, or tribal partner, or perhaps with a nonprofit, such as a university, working on violence prevention or researching terrorist recruitment online. We are committed to protecting this nation and staying focused on this work. And we believe this strategy can guide us for years to come. As Justice Thurgood Marshall said upon receiving the Liberty Medal from the National Constitution Center, democracy just cannot flourish amid fear. Liberty cannot bloom amid hate. Justice cannot take root amid rage. America must get to work. That's exactly what we're doing. We are getting to work. So with that, I'll now turn things back to Fran, who knows very well the challenges of serving as Homeland Security Advisor and tackling existential threats. Fran, thank you again for making this time for this conversation with me.
Liz, thank you so much for the remarks. Thank you for the strategy. I think it really outlines very clearly your priorities. Before we talk about the strategy, though, look, the position you're in, I was in, has gone through a period of where after 9/11, it was of primary importance, but it was downgraded. I don't think in the last couple of years, anybody could even name who the Homeland Security Advisor was, and the position was much junior. That's changed. Can you talk a little bit about how it's organized? And I hate this, but the average day, there's no average day in the West Wing, as you know, but describe for us what you do and how it works.
Thanks very much, Fran. Well, it is true that the position of Homeland Security Advisor at the Assistant to the President level was disestablished by the previous administration. And so one of the first decisions that was made in building a new national security team was to reestablish at the Assistant to the President level, which is the most senior level of positions in the White House in support of the President, the Homeland Security Advisor to the President, and also to have this person be an integral member of the national security team. So that is why I'm also a Deputy National Security Advisor. And in that capacity, the senior team, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, John Feiner, the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor, and I see the President every morning. We begin our day with the Presidential Daily Briefing, which is the opportunity that we have based on the rigorous and disciplined effort to assemble and present to the President the current intelligence and the threat streams that we are observing, the important information that a president needs to have at his fingertips and in his mind in order to make the vital decisions that he needs to make to ensure the safety and security of the American people and of our allies and partners around the world. So that's how we start every day. It begins for me at 6:40 in the morning with reading an intelligence briefing myself, being briefed live then by a briefer who comes from the intelligence community and beginning that preparation in support of the President.
Well, the good news is it sounds like the position and the process around it has returned to kind of what most of us in the policy process would consider normal. Has that policy process also sort of gone back to normal, that where you've got the assistant secretaries, the deputies, and the principals reviewing policy, sort of coming to agreements or teasing out disagreements before it gets served up to the President? Is that a process that's sort of now been reestablished?
Yes, I think that was originally described as the model of leading and managing the national security decision-making process that was established by Brent Scowcroft, who was a hero to many of us in the national security field, certainly a mentor to me. And indeed, we have reestablished what we describe as regular order. And that involves a full interagency process. It begins at the sub-IPC level, the Interagency Policy Committee level, that's at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level across the interagency with directors at the White House leading those deliberations, then up to the Assistant Secretary level led by senior directors on the national security team, up to the deputies level as you described it, and then up to the principals level, and finally to the National Security Council when the president convenes a meeting for decision making. And it has been welcomed, I will say, by our interagency colleagues who are pleased to see the restoration of that kind of disciplined, rigorous process of evaluation of information, of presentation of options, of decision making that we have come to rely on to ensure that we can both advance our interests and protect our national security. So we do that every day, and I'm honored to be a part of this team that has rebuilt that process. And this policy process that led to the promulgation of our new national strategy reflects exactly that kind of evaluation of information, gathering of facts that I described in my remarks, and then the development of the strategy up through the deputies and the principals, and with the blessing of the president, then we presented it to the world last week for the first time.
That's great. So talk to me, before we dive into the report, can you describe for us kind of the terrorism landscape as you see it? It's very different from, it seems like eons ago I was there, but it is really morphed over time. You deal with very different threats than I had to deal with. Can you describe the current landscape as you see it?
Well, Fran, it has evolved significantly over 20 years, and some of that is because of the extraordinary work that was done by my predecessors, including you, in building the architecture that I mentioned in my speech that has enabled us to ensure the security of our nation after 9/11. And we have deterred and disrupted many, many threats to the homeland. And so that has changed the landscape significantly for us as Americans. That does not mean that terrorism does not exist in many forms and in many places. And what we do see coming back into public service now and having access to the intelligence information that becomes available when you do assume a role like mine is that the threat picture has become a much more diffuse and diverse threat picture with respect to terrorist activity, and that much of it is regionally based and regionally focused, though there are still groups that target the United States and certainly target our interests around the world. So we're dealing with a landscape that is quite significantly altered around the world, in addition to the evolution of a threat at home, which I've described today to you. And so we are keeping our eyes, I've said, on both of those sets of challenges, both with some similarities, but quite substantial differences in both their dimensions and how we address them.
So we have an audience question from Joel Strouch. How important is it to have the public and media on board on the administration's view of domestic terrorism? And where is the resistance coming from to the public and media adopting this view that you've described?
Well, we certainly have made every effort to present this strategy, again, in a very fact-based way and to provide to the public the full extent of what we have decided we need to do to face this threat. And in our engagements with many different media organizations and with many different stakeholder groups, as I described it, we have met with quite affirmative support across the spectrum. And we have found that the media has been very receptive to learning about the full scope of this work in the 4 pillars that I described it, and that we have been able, in a quite inflamed media landscape, to find a place to speak about this that has given us a chance to explain why this work is so important to the public safety, the national security, and the values of our country.
Liz, you talked about the insider threat and what you're doing to combat it. Justin Doubleday, a reporter with the Federal News Network, asked the question, the administration's strategy includes updates to the screening of federal employees to root out domestic extremists. However, The Intercept just reported a Navy training document that labels socialists in the same category as anarchists and neo-Nazis as a terrorist ideological category. Can you comment on the report, and how should agencies identify domestic terrorists as they update their insider threat programs?
I'm not aware of the report. I will say that the work is now work in progress to identify the appropriate ways in our screening questionnaires that we can identify those who may be radicalized to violence without violating civil liberties. And that's the hard work that everyone's going to have to do, both in the Office of Personnel Management and in the agencies that will be leading these efforts.
Ellen Gilmer asks, the plan notes that the executive branch is weighing whether it should push for legislative reforms, including new criminal laws. Can you address what options are being explored on this front? And is there any target timeline for such an assessment?
Thank you for asking that question. So we considered this very carefully, as there have been calls for further legislative efforts to create new authorities. We evaluated the information that we had at hand and decided that it was appropriate to ask our Justice Department to conduct a thorough review, to evaluate the cases, to assess the data, to do the analysis, and then come back to the President with a recommendation about whether they believe that we already have the necessary authorities to prosecute those who violate the law as domestic terrorists, or whether something new would be necessary with which we'd have to work with Congress to secure those authorities. And we don't know the answer to that yet. That's work that is now getting underway. And I'm confident that Attorney General Garland and the Deputy Lisa Monaco, who preceded me in my role in the previous administration, will come back to us with a very well-considered recommendation when they're done with their analysis.
So Jenny Hansman asks, does the government have an estimate on numbers of white nationalist terrorists in our country?
I don't have an estimate that I have seen that I think we can express with certainty. There are a variety of different categories and different ways in which we look at this threat, and so there isn't a number that I would stand on today.
Larry Bradley says, the strategy is very comprehensive. As you stressed in your comments, actions via implementation are important. It sounds like most of the work so far has been focused on policy. What are the biggest inhibitors you are facing in trying to implement these policies? And how do you convince state and local governments to implement these actions?
First of all, we haven't really encountered impediments. What we have found is that we have very eager partners. Our own departments and agencies have been enthusiastic participants in this process, and indeed, in cases such as the one I described with respect to the Department of Homeland Security, our Secretary of Homeland Security moved out with some of the actions before we were done with the strategy. We knew they were synergistic with and would be included in the strategy, but he wanted to get out there right away because it was so important to begin this prevention work, given some of the developments that we have already experienced just in our first 5 months in government and in the weeks preceding that. So we have found enormous cooperation in the agencies and willingness to work collaboratively. With respect to state and local partners, we also know there's a huge hunger for this and a desire to work with us collaboratively in prevention and in disruption and deterrence. And so we are confident that we will be able to build and strengthen this architecture over time to meet the challenges that will continue to present themselves in this domain. I actually believe, just as democracy is an ongoing process, not a static condition, that so too will this work be. This will be something we'll be doing for a long time in the future, and we need to build a system that we can rely upon, that upholds our values, that strengthens our democracy, and that secures our nation.
So Oliver Knox from the Washington Post has 2 questions. First, with what frequency have domestic threats risen to the PDB level over the last 6 months?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear who asked the question. There's a little bit of fuzziness in the sound.
Sorry. Oliver Knox from the Washington Post asks, with what frequency did domestic threats rise to the PDB?
So I'm not able to talk specifically about what we discuss in the PDB, but I will say that we have had frequent discussions about these issues. And as I noted, we have briefed the President a number of times on this topic, and he's been very keenly interested in the progress of our development of the strategy and in the specifics of the strategy, and asked numerous questions of each of his cabinet members and of me about the content and guided us very specifically to ensure that at every step we have taken in this process, we have been upholding our civil liberties and civil rights while we ensure the safety and security of our people.
The second question he had, do domestic extremists plot to attack specific targets as foreign extremists do, or do they mostly seek to set up confrontations with the opportunity to be violent? How does this shape your efforts to disrupt them?
You know, these are mostly still lone actors who are expressing interest in violent acts, either racially motivated acts, as I've said, or acts that are anti-government, anti-institutional acts. And we don't have a great deal of evidence of large-scale organization or mobilization in groups to violence, very different from what we observe in some of the foreign efforts that Fran is familiar with top-down, very mobilized, leader-driven efforts. And we are seeing people who are very frustrated and alienated at home being mobilized to violence and looking at ways in which they can express their frustration or their desire to change things through violence.
Brian Craig asks, how involved is the Vice President and her staff in terms of the strategy and the President's daily briefing?
Such an important question, and I should have said that already. Thank you for asking it. The Vice President is also present in the daily briefings, the presidential daily briefings that I described, and she has her own National Security Advisor who participates in those briefings. The Vice President's team has been integrated into this process at every step. The Vice President has also participated in the briefings that I've described to you involving the relevant cabinet members. She has been an active participant and has had a very important voice in the development of the strategy and will participate also in its implementation.
Merle Langley asks, could you characterize the evolution of militia groups? They have become more active, grown in number and threat capability. And do you have a sense that DHS has the necessary intelligence assets to be able to track these groups?
So I think it's an important distinction to make, which perhaps is a semantic issue in using the word militia violent extremist. Militia violent extremist does not necessarily mean organization into a militia-like unit. And that's why I indicated in response to a previous question that these are not large, currently not large organized groups planning collective action. Militia violent extremism refers to those who are anti-institutional and anti-government violent extremists. People who want to use violence because they believe the government is interfering in their daily life in ways that are abhorrent to them. And so we've seen, for example, some greater interest in actions against public figures in light of the COVID pandemic, when people have felt that they have not been able to live their lives as they want to, that there are requirements in some places to wear masks, or requirements not to go out and enjoy a night on the town. This has been a period of time in which those who feel that the government is interfering with their life have in some cases, been radicalized to violence.
So Denise Kirshner on that topic asks the question, but how do you address if these are individuals who are radicalized and that it arises from bigotry or misinformation, racism or mental health issues, how do you address that issue, whether it's in person, right, or it's online?
So this is an enormous challenge for law enforcement because you have to differentiate between people who need help and who are in a place where they might benefit most from some kind of mental health intervention if we become aware of it quickly enough, and those who are radicalized to violence and planning to act or have acted in a way that means that law enforcement needs to engage. And this is painstaking work, again, pointing to this issue of our uniqueness and the need to uphold civil liberties, respect freedom of expression, allow freedom of expression online, but not allow the exploitation of that freedom to create a public safety hazard, to threaten people in our own country, to lead to violent acts. One of the things I mentioned was the importance of this work on prevention involving the role of those who may see somebody trending toward violence, who may see somebody amassing weapons, who may see somebody expressing anger. What can be done early to intervene in the way that, as I noted, if you see something, say something. How can we create a safe space where family members may feel confident in reaching out for help, where coworkers may feel that they can reach out for help without fear of recrimination, and help us to ensure that as a community, as a country, we're able to engage people before they have gone over that line and used violence to express their political views. That violence being inimical to our democracy, that violence being illegal.
As you've mentioned, sort of online radicalization, the individuals, this was a really tough issue when we were dealing with the foreign terrorist threat. Getting companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter to cooperate. They were very slow to that game. They got there eventually, but they were slow. How's the cooperation and working relationships with these online platforms that sort of wind up to be distribution centers for some of this material?
It's a huge challenge, as I noted in my remarks, and it's an ongoing project for us. The work that we need to do is collaborative, very similar to work that I've done in prior roles and now again in this role, in efforts to build a partnership with those in the private sector who own our critical infrastructure. The federal government cannot do this work alone. The federal government needs private sector partners to secure our nation, and whether it's dealing with threats to our energy grid or threats that may emanate online, as we're discussing, we need that partnership with the private sector. The federal government brings things to the table that the private sector needs to know. And so one of the ways in which this works best is if we establish that two-way street, the flow of information that we can provide, helping them to understand what's being done on their platforms, what we see and recognize that they may not see, and what they can then do about it to ensure that their platforms aren't exploited in ways that are inconsistent with the standards and values that they have ascribed to. I'll also note that we felt it was very important to join forces with other countries because there is strength in numbers. And with the more than 50 countries that are participating in the Christchurch call and working with the social media companies, there's a greater ability to together create incentives and mobilize action on the part of the social media companies that do need to act in this space to assist us in this shared mission.
Daniel Smith asks, what is the concern that members of the military and law enforcement, while not necessarily fully radicalized, are sympathetic to the causes of domestic terrorists and white nationalists? What programs are being considered to investigate these sympathies?
This is an initiative that's being led by Secretary of Defense Austin and his team, and that work is just being developed as part of the strategy. So I can't describe that in detail yet. You may, if you watch this space, have already noticed that Secretary Austin requested a full military-wide stand-down. That is something that is done when there's a force-wide issue that needs attention, that requires attention at every level of the force. And Secretary Austin initiated that while we were in the midst of developing the strategy because he believes it's so important to tackle this head on. So you will see in the weeks and months ahead how he will approach this, and we'll look forward to working collaboratively with him and his team on implementation.
Kevin Haney asks, how do you view your relationship and differences between your position, the DHS Secretary, the National Cyber Director, and the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber in prevention of and response to major domestic cybersecurity incidents?
So we are one team, one fight. I think that's the best way to describe it. In this administration thus far, we all have come in with a sense of the profound opportunity and responsibility that we have to strengthen our nation's security against a wide range of threats that we face, including cyber threats. I have known Ali Mayorkas since I was in high school. We are very close partners. We speak multiple times a week and see each other. I believe he sees me this way. I certainly see him this way as a force multiplier. I work very closely with the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber on a range of issues. The new cyber director that was mandated by Congress has just been confirmed, Chris Inglis. I worked with him in his prior role when I served in the Obama administration, and others as well. We are all working in a collaborative way, in a very disciplined process, as I described it previously, to bring the full strength of the whole enterprise to bear in tackling these very difficult challenges. And I feel very fortunate to have such super talented colleagues to work with, because these are very tough problems to face.
Liz, the cyber issue has been raised now. Let me ask you, we all have read the headlines, whether it's Colonial Pipeline or the meat packing, and there's a big debate about ransomware and how to handle it. Should the government require reporting in a timely way and set out guidelines? And will you also look at a policy for whether or not, just as we did in the hostage side, whether or not there should be paying of ransoms and under what circumstances?
So this is, of course, work underway now, and we are working through the sets of issues that we're presented with in the face of growing ransomware threats and attacks on critical infrastructure. And the Colonial Pipeline experience was one which gave us an opportunity to examine, as a new team, the kinds of challenges that we'll face going forward without it being a debilitating attack. So that was actually, I think, from my perspective as somebody who likes to prepare for big events before they happen, this is a chance for us to strengthen our muscles in dealing with this kind of challenge. The truth is that we face a tension in this space between our desire never to pay ransom, whether it's to foreign terrorists or to ransomware actors, and at the same time, our need to ensure that our critical infrastructure functions, especially in lifeline sectors for our nation. And so we have to work that through, again, within the team and with our private sector partners, to develop an approach that incentivizes the kind of reporting you've asked the question about, and also the kind of collaboration that will ensure that we don't reward those who attack our critical infrastructure, and at the same time can ensure that we are able to bring that infrastructure back online as quickly as possible to support the lives of our people across the country.
Liz, given the tragedy of January 6th, I think there's no one who saw what happened and wasn't shaken by it. There's obviously debate in Congress about whether or not there should be a commission to look at it. Putting Congress's ideas aside, the federal government has its own interest in understanding the lessons, whether there are intelligence failures, how we can strengthen the system. Can you talk a little bit about the lessons learned and from January 6th and what we're doing to prevent another like attack?
Well, first of all, the whole strategy is focused on many of the elements of what was underlying the attack. But in terms of the response itself on January 6th, I have led work to look in collaboration with the National Capital Police and those who provide security across the National Capital Region at what kinds of improvements are necessary to ensure security in this area, which has the leading government institutions, the federal government, the Congress, and the judiciary branch here in Washington, D.C. And that is ongoing work among many agencies of government and the many law enforcement agencies that are present in the National Capital Region to ensure the closest coordination, early communication of information. As we've indicated, that's part of this strategy, coordinated response, the development of capabilities that in the National Capital Police Force have been identified as requiring strengthening, and other elements that will ensure that in the future, not only do we prevent things like this from happening, but should they happen, that we're fully prepared to respond to them effectively.
William Easton asks, how much foreign influence is there within the white supremacists and hate groups within the US? Do we track these foreign groups, and how are the domestic groups influenced by the foreign actors?
Thanks for the question. As you will have heard in my remarks, this is largely an inside-out problem rather than an outside-in problem, unlike the kinds of threat streams that you were seeing, Fran, when you were here with foreign-directed, foreign-supported terrorist groups targeting the homeland. The individuals who are mobilized in either individually or in some of the named groups here in the United States do have connections to those overseas who share similar views. We see those connections principally online, and they are exchanging views. They are in communication. What we're not seeing yet is collaboration to act. Now that may evolve, but at the moment this is principally about sharing in views across borders, across oceans, with those who may have a similar perspective. So for example, you might have those who espouse views in a country like Germany that descend from a Nazi heritage, and those who have white nationalist views in the United States communicating with one another. But for the time being, at least, this is principally something that is homegrown in our case, animated by the kinds of perspectives that I described in my remarks.
And how do you define domestic terrorism, right? How do you make distinctions between what is political speech, social advocacy, but crosses a line? Where is that line and how do you define it?
The crossing of the line is the mobilization to violence and the acts that are therefore illegal in our country. We cherish, we prize, we celebrate free speech and free expression of views. It's when that free expression becomes violent and crosses the line into illegal acts that threaten lives or the buildings of or the possessions of those in our country who are private citizens going about their daily business, or people working in the government who are serving their people. That's when we're talking about domestic terrorism. It's that crossing of the line to seeking to harm people or harm those the infrastructure in our country that causes us to then define it as being an act of domestic terrorism. If it's motivated by these kinds of views that I've described in my remarks, views that are antithetical to our values and which cause people to cross the line into violence.
Thomas Neal asks, Antifa violence has disrupted our cities for over a year. Do you acknowledge that they too are in a domestic terrorist group? And what is being done to investigate Antifa?
I'm sorry, I missed the question because the sound faded out. Would you say it again, please?
Sure. Thomas Neal asks, states, Antifa violence has disrupted our cities for over a year. What are you doing to investigate it? And does the administration acknowledge that Antifa is a domestic terror threat?
So we're looking at any group that uses violence to achieve its political ends. And what happens is the Department of Justice and the FBI will pursue at various levels investigations if that is something that they have identified as a legitimate investigation, and will pursue it to its appropriate conclusion. And we're not judging by virtue of the group or its political orientation. We're judging by the actions they've taken which may break the law.
Liz, have you seen you must have seen both similarities and differences in terms of the threat and what's effective against it from the foreign terrorism side to the domestic terrorism side. Can you give us a sense of what are the similarities and differences and what tools work on both?
So some of this would require us to go back and ask the sort of fundamental questions about what motivates people in other countries to radicalize to terrorism. Alienation, lack of opportunity, ideology, often driven by extremist ideology. If you think about Al-Qaeda, for example, which you worked on, Fran, a view about imposing a certain kind of law on the world that's contrary to our values in this country. There is less of that kind of ideology that we're seeing in the United States, unless you believe that white supremacy is an ideology. It's not a religious ideology that is dominant, as it may be in some of the international terrorist groups. It's more of, as I noted, racially motivated violent extremism or anti-government extremism that is principally the focus here of those who are choosing to use violence to resort to violence to achieve their political ends. Whereas we see a more a diverse and quite and as I've noted, also more diffuse international threat with a variety of mobilizing and motivating principles, and some of them with actually a lack of clarity about what it is that they are animated to violence about, except that that seems to be something that gives them a cause to believe in the places in which they are acting, places that are often quite impoverished and desperate for opportunity without government that is effective in delivering services to people, and where people are quite vulnerable to exploitation, to extortion by terrorist groups, and where there is insufficient opportunity for young people who may be radicalized to violence by the sense that this gives them a cause and a purpose.
Last question. We'll let you get back to work. Tell me, we read a lot about foreign actors, Russia, for example, inserting themselves in our domestic political discourse, whether it was on Twitter or Facebook, with fake accounts, trying to sort of make those divisions broader, worse, right? Whether it was Black Lives Matter or defund the police. Do we see foreign actors, and if so, is it Russia, is it China? Who is it that tries to take advantage of our own internal debates or fuel that? And are they doing it with domestic terrorism, white supremacy?
Thank you for asking that question. It's a very important question. I did allude to this when I was in the remarks speaking about the fact that we know that our rivals are trying to sow divisions in our society, and there is no question of that. So we do see, through the social media companies in particular, that there is use of these platforms to try to sow divisions and fan the flames of what is already happening. It's not instigated by foreign actors from what we know today with respect to our domestic terrorist activity, but it is, there are those who seek to exacerbate it and promulgate it in a way that can create further division and dysfunction in the United States, which is one of the reasons that it's so important to us that we work with these companies to create greater resilience, to create greater digital literacy, to ensure that these platforms are not exploited by whoever chooses to exploit them, to create that kind of challenge in our country that can really go to the very heart of our democracy and undermine our ability to stand together in the face of the real challenges that we face today and in the future.
Liz, thank you so much for your time. I know how busy you are, having sat in that seat. And honestly, thank you for your public service and your service to the country. So we are grateful to have had you with us. Micah, back to you.
Thank you so much. It's my privilege to be here today, and I'm honored to be speaking with you on this virtual podium.
Thanks to both of you so much for this discussion of the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. I just want to say on behalf of UVA's President's Office, the Institute of Democracy, the Miller Center, and the Karsh Center for Law and Democracy, we're very grateful to both of you, to Dr. Sherwood-Randall and to Ms. Townsend, and also to all of you in our audience for really excellent questions for our conversation today. I hope you will join us in the future as we continue our series of democracy dialogues at the University of Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you.